Hello,
What's going
hello.
on, guys? How we doing today?
Welcome back to the
Welcome back
podcast.
to a Third Perspective podcast.
Third Perspective podcast.
Today we have got a little bit of epigenetics for y'all.
Epigenetics.
So before we get too far into it, right? What's new?
What is new?
What's been going on with us?
Not much. Not much is new. You know, same old, same old. Work, school, podcast, work, school, podcast.
A little bit of everything.
Little bit of everything, indeed.
Let's see. Well, you just went to where did you go yesterday?
Oh, I went to Bass Lake around Angel Falls. I did a hike
Nice.
there. I was expecting to see more snow, but because it did snow on Thursday there, but it melted all
Yeah.
in around 2 days.
It just doesn't stay
So-
cold enough.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
issue.
The thing is, it didn't really snow enough for it to be like a thick enough layer that resists more of the sunlight and everything. So
Yeah.
yeah, it melted off pretty quick. But what about you? What have you been up to?
Work, school. Nothing super interesting the past week or weekend. Yeah. I mean, I'm sore as always. So tired. We had daylight savings was last night,
I
so
know,
I
I
went to
know.
sleep at like
We're
3:30,
we're extra sleepy boys today.
3:45. Woke up at 8. So we're gonna just have a chill day. Nice chill discussion for you guys.
Chill discussion.
So let's dive into things.
So what are we talking about today?
So we're going to be talking about epigenetics and kind of from a psychological standpoint primarily, not super biological, just because it can get really overwhelming if we really dive into like genes and stuff like that, the genome. But first we'll start off with the introduction. So epigenetics refers to changes in gene expression that do not involve alterations to the DNA sequence itself, but are influenced by environmental factors. So this is like things that are out of our control, right? You can go in and alter DNA, which is kind of what we were talking about, which may be the future, which is like the CRISPR.
Yeah. Well, we've been able to use CRISPR for a while to get rid of some like bad genes or get rid of some diseases. But one of the implications there would be, through CRISPR, you can basically modify the DNA strand of people and basically code for new genes.
Yeah, which would be life changing for lots
They
of
they call it
people.
quote unquote playing God because it kind of
Yeah.
is. You're kind of like selectively modifying people. Really interesting.
It's crazy how we can do that. It's actually insane.
Yeah, how far we've got. Well, it's funny because 200 years ago we were still like, we couldn't even
what the hell
fly.
is a genome? Yeah.
You know what I mean? 200 years ago, I guess the world was black and white, and all of a sudden we're here.
Yeah, so it's crazy to think of it. So a little bit of etymology. The word epigenetics comes from the Greek prefix epi, meaning above or on top of, and genetics, which refers to genes and heredity. So essentially, epigenetics means like above genetics, highlighting how factors beyond DNA influence genetic expression. So like, if you think of it like the generation above, and so on and so forth. So like everybody before you is influencing how your genes, how your individual
Yeah, your
gene
genetic
expressions
your
are.
genetic makeup. That's
Which kind of ties back into the whole free will
yeah.
shit, right?
That's well, that's when you
It all
you
ties
go
back
you
to
go
free
back
will.
not necessarily to your grandparents, but then like your grandparents,
Yeah.
and the culture that they lived in and how the world was set up back then. So are genetic traits that continuously carry over, but they're also ultimately affected by the environment.
Yeah.
I mean, you have all kinds of like gene expressions within your body. There's the obvious one, like your phenotype, the way you look.
Well,
like
yeah.
and
Well, there's
everything else.
phenotype and genotype.
But yes, you also have the genotype, which then correlates
Which is
with
what
all
you
the
possess.
behavior, exactly, like responses to the environment and all of these things.
Which is super funny because you've seen my parents now. And you see, they
Yeah,
both don't have colored eyes.
He's definitely adopted. I
Okay.
cannot.
All right. But like, for
kidding, I'm
example,
kidding.
you see my parents, they both do not have colored eyes. My sister does not have colored eyes. I do not think my grandma did. I'm pretty sure my grandfather didn't.
There has to be some
But-
sort of recessive.
That's what I'm saying. 'Cause they
dominance
they
at this
have the
point.
genotype. They
Yeah.
did not have the phenotype.
Yeah.
And something is, I don't know, something happened, and I've got it.
Adoption. Just kidding.
My whole family, my mom told me a few years ago, when I was born, my whole family, they called me hijo de lechero. Yeah.
Milkman's son.
Yeah, so we didn't, I don't think we had a milkman.
Not after you were born.
Not after. Not anymore. Not anymore.
All right.
Um,
So psychological relevance. How is this relevant for the?
so this can explain how life experiences, trauma, and environmental exposures can shape behavior and mental health across generations. So one thing we'll touch on is a little theory that I don't remember the doctor's name, but she was brilliant. The fact that they were able to study this in mice. Um, but the concept is called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And so that is a mouthful. But what that basically means is that generational trauma is real and it has been studied and it has been essentially proven through studies with like naked mole rats and stuff.
I wouldn't. I don't know if I would use the word proven, but
There's strong
there's an
sorry, there's
overwhelming
strong
amount of evidence
Yeah,
that
there's
points
strong
towards
evidence
the
that points
conclusion.
towards it. Yeah. So the first thing I want to get into is the traditional perspective of the nature versus nurture debate. So historically, this debate has focused kind of on whether genetics, nature, or environment, your nurture, plays a greater role in shaping behavior. And I know we've touched upon this a few times, but
It's huge. I mean, you talk about nature versus nurture
it's an
debates on
ongoing debate.
almost any sort of biological conclusion that you want to make, whether it's like human development, like development in childhood, later on in age. There's so many things that contribute
It,
and that go back to that.
it's kind of like the chicken or the egg question. What came first, the
Yeah, it's kind
environment
of
or the genetics?
yeah, it's kind of like they both came at the same time. When it
Because
comes
like
to nurture
I
and
mean,
nurture.
you almost want to think back all the way to like the earliest humans, right? But then it's like, well, how did we get there? The genome kept developing and developing from what fish? We were like
Essentially,
fish
like
at some points.
unicellular forms of
Yeah,
life swimming in a or like
prokaryotes and
existing in a
stuff.
pond of salt and ashes.
Yeah, but like something pushed us along to develop and change, right? Something in the environment.
Yeah.
So it's crazy to think of it like that. So
Yeah, it's how the nurture, like the environment, affects genetics,
uh-huh.
and then how like our genetics, also like the way we evolve as humans, also affects the environment we live in,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. We have a huge impact on how the environment is nowadays. Like
Yeah.
you
For
look
example,
at
a good example there is, for example, you know, we were cavemen. We lived in tribes at some point. But then at some point we realized, like, oh wow, getting together with other humans actually makes a lot of sense. Like it aids our survival, right? So then genetically we become really pro-social humans, and then we start building homes. Then from building homes, we start building, I don't know,
communities and
castles,
neighborhood. Oh
communities, like agriculture, waterways, all of these things,
urbanism,
and
all
then
that stuff.
how urban development then affects us humans. Like all of a sudden, I'm here freaking out because I don't have a 401k and I'm super stressed, and then my kids are gonna inherit that stress from the made-up world that we built
Yeah,
through the development of society.
and it's crazy because you can even see that stuff pretty not recent, but like you could see it even as early as like a couple hundred years ago. You could see has like we've talked about if your cultures have gone accustomed to not consuming milk, you're going to develop that milk intolerance.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's like what we're talking about, whether it's like we shape the environment.
And then the environment shapes us.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing relationship with it.
So this is where epigenetics kind of comes in and brings it all together, bridges it all together, if you will. It demonstrates that environmental factors can influence gene expression, thus intertwining nature and nurture, like what we just said. Um, so a couple examples are this is, I feel like, the easiest one to kind of describe and kind of conceptualize for everybody. Um, Studies on identical twins show that despite having the same genetic makeup, because identical twins are carbon copies of each other, essentially, right? Fraternal twins are the uh, similar, like same egg. When you have identical twins, one sperm cell fertilize the same egg. When you have fraternal twins, somehow there was two eggs that were fertilized by two different sperm cells. So, um, environmental influences can lead to different psychological outcomes in identical twins. So it's really interesting, and it all ties back to that it all ties back to epigenetics. But it's funny because like there's a Kendrick Lamar song that I love. You want to talk about something while I find it?
Well, I was looking at like epigenetic expression in the womb as a baby, because that's been a massive area of study, because while there is a baby in a woman's womb, the embryo, that's when it happens to be the most susceptible to epigenetic changes. So whether the mother is stressed, mad, whether she's a chronic smoker or a drinker, or she's undergoing like a really tough moment in her life, that will actually affect the baby in ways that we wouldn't have imagined before.
Absolutely. I mean,
Especially as there is critical stages of development within the womb that will affect more the baby. A huge one of this, it's organogenesis. It happens. I forgot it's exactly the stage in which it happens, but it's the part where the cells in the baby are dividing and forming organs. During that time, if you expose the baby to any sort of toxic substance, most likely it will most likely be detrimental for the development of organs within the womb.
absolutely. I mean, and that's like, I feel like it's science is so funny because like you have to be like absolutely correct. Like it can't be it in science. The way things work for them to be like laws is it can't be proven wrong for it to be a law. And so that's why so many things are theories. But like we learned that like if a woman or if a mother is experiencing a lot of stress during pregnancy, babies will come out like leaner and skinnier and stuff like that. And then there's actually like a lot of studies and evidence that proves to them having like cardiovascular diseases or like diabetes and stuff like that.
It's interesting because from the point you're in the womb, your mom's actions are already developing your potential DNA expression,
Mm-hmm.
and how that potential DNA expression will later on affect your behavior,
Yeah,
which is really interesting. Like you're either giving good tools for a better life or not before you're even born.
I cannot find this freaking.
What are you looking for?
I'm looking for this lyric that Kendrick Lamar said in a song. Essentially, he did a really good. He like talked about his upbringing and about how his dad was like really cool with like a gangster. His dad worked at like a Popeyes or something,
Yeah.
and he talked about how he was cool with this gangster, and he would like always hook him up to the drive-through. And it came to a spot where like this gangster had to choose between killing him or like keeping him alive, and he chose somebody else to kill.
Oh
And
man, that's rough.
what ended up happening is like Kendrick like saw this, and like these two people, him and his dad and that guy, were like the same. They had the same exact. They were like the same.
Yeah.
They were literally in different places, different parts of their lives, and that led to where they were. And so, do you see how I was saying like it's the
Causality.
yeah, and it's funny because it shows that so many different things can have an impact on who you are. All right, let me tie things
Much
back.
more than than you
Yeah,
causing an impact
much
on
more
who
than
you
working
are.
on a Popeyes, you know. Okay, let's talk about transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, which is what you were talking about earlier. Um, and this is the concept is that environmental stressors, traumas, and experiences of one generation can influence the gene expression of subsequent generations. So, in better terms for like even us to understand, everything that your parents experience, or even like your grandparents or your great great grandparents, all of the stuff that they experience can influence the genes that come through, and not only in their kids, but their kids' kids and their kids' kids' kids. Um, and some of the examples of that are Holocaust survivor descendants, right? So there are studies that indicate that the altered stress response in the offspring of Holocaust survivors is linked to epigenetic modifications. So we know that like any Holocaust survivors, they've been through extreme trauma and stress. If they go on to have kids, children, stuff like that, the kids also suffer from those issues,
Yep.
whether it's like diabetes or cardiovascular disease, right? But what we're seeing now, because now it's the generation, like my parents are like the late stage baby boomers, which is like, which would kind of be also that generation of,
Generation what?
sorry, I'm so tired.
Losing his
Uh,
train of
so that
thought.
would also be that same generation of kids of like people mothering children from World War II. But now we're seeing like my generation, Santi's generations having kids, and those kids exhibiting those same, still expressing those same genes, where it's like they're also having these issues from way back then. Like they can tie it to way back then because their parents survived, or their parents also displayed those. Uh,
Nice. I found it.
okay.
So,
Thank you.
I was looking at this. I was looking at this study. Something I learned in class a few semesters ago, and then they talk about the MAOA gene, and so this is a certain gene that's been highly correlated with violence and like violent behavior in
Uh-huh.
kids. But this gene only gets sort of fed by experiences if the children undergoes abuse.
Oh, okay.
So what really triggers the expression of this gene and its later correlation with violent behavior is a huge correlation there is having been abused as a child or
Sure.
not.
Yeah. That's crazy because
It's really interesting because it's a really clear example on how epigenetics and how the environment will ultimately not just dictate but influence highly the gene expression
yeah.
in us humans.
So not only will it make that child the brain abuse, or it's not brain, the child abuse will make that child more violent, but it'll carry on
Yes,
in the future.
it will. Yeah,
And
it will have a.
that's very much that very ties into this because that's literally generational trauma.
It is generational trauma. Yeah.
And that's one thing that me and him talk about is we were I don't I mean I wasn't abused as a kid.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't want to get into that too much for us if that's sensitive, but like we talk about constantly about breaking the cycle, and one of the big hardest things with breaking the cycle is like you have to be aware of stuff that happened in the past,
Yeah, you have to be aware
and
of
then
the problem in order
you
to
have to
fix it.
learn and stuff like that, and because you're already going to be predisposed to have that stuff, you're already going to have that gene is
Yeah.
going to be expressed within you and your children, so you have to teach them and educate them on how they can also help break the cycle. But another example of this is the Dutch hunger winter. So also in that World War II time period, the Dutch had a hunger winter. But now we're seeing that children of individuals who endured famine during pregnancy showed risks of metabolic and psychological disorders. And now the children's children, so like grandparents of people or grandchildren of people who experienced this hunger winter, are also seeing these metabolic and psychological disorders. So it's crazy
That's
how it's
tough. Yeah.
going back. Yeah, it's really really cool. Or, sorry,
Yeah.
not real cool.
It feels as though
It's very
it
interesting.
triggers. It feels as though it triggers this like ongoing chain and cycle of
Because yeah, I mean,
genetic
yeah, your
changes.
body is seeing like, oh, we're going to we're going through some really extreme stuff. Let me better equip the next generation to deal with this stuff. Or
Yep.
like now, like, oh, this stuff is really harmful for the body. Like these are the effects that it's having on the body. Now it's going to be passed on.
It's funny because there's certain things that they're harder to change epigenetically, if that's even a word. For example, diet. Like yes, you can change your diet, but one thing that is really hard to change is that your brain is predisposed to eating highly fatty foods. I mean, I'm serious. Like
yeah.
our caveman brains are highly predisposed to liking fatty foods. And then you ask like why? Well, back then when
Well,
we
there's
were
a lot of
hunters and
dopamine that's
gatherers.
released when you consume those foods
Yes,
too.
but why? Back then we were hunters and gatherers. Most animals, just like us, were trying to survive.
Yeah.
So they didn't have a lot of fat. They weren't able to hunt like cows or wagyu around. They were hunting
it's-
skinny, really
And
skinny
those things are
animals
usually
that
pretty
lacked
satiating.
a lot of fats. Yeah. So for us humans, finding those fats and like finding fatty substances aided our survival so much more.
neuron
'Cause-
activation.
Yeah, there you go. Because now you have so much more energy and you have so much more ways to store food within your body
Yeah.
through fat.
That's what fat
So
is. Fat storage is.
Our brains really like the idea of storing fat, and it brings us to nowadays society where there is fast food everywhere, and our fat craving brains are gonna eat a lot of fast food because that's what's available.
So yeah, that's kind of what I don't remember. I don't remember the. I don't have it written down, but
We're highly tied to our biological wiring, and then also
Yes.
the environmental wiring that comes with it.
so I vaguely remember how it went, but that ties into our next point of epigenetic examples across cultures and ethnicities. So we're going to be approaching this in a purely academic way, right? We're not going to make any. We're not going to come to any conclusions on stereotypes or anything like that. This is just the evidence. It's purely evidence. So one of the first ones that I remember reading was um, Pacific Islander and Samoan cultures. They're
Island boys. Sorry, I
so
have to say it.
they're very susceptible to picking up weight quickly. So this is derived from them being like sailors and navigators on the open seas and stuff like that in those areas. So whenever they consumed stuff, they would hold it on and put it into fat storages. But also back then, it would also be like they'd also put on muscle very quickly too. So now you see like the few Samoans that I've known or Tongans that I've known, they're huge, bro. Like they're just so big. A couple kids I knew went pro because like they're just huge. Like they just already had that advantage. But now some of the adverse effects of that is like if you don't take care of yourselves, you're more likely to be obese. Like obesity is very common. Heart disease is very common. Gout.
Yeah,
Gout is another thing
it's
that's
interesting
common.
because
I'm
it's
not
it's
fully.
taking our bodies and like our genetic wiring. It takes sometimes many generations to even readjust to the rapid changes that we're experiencing in society.
Yeah.
And I feel like that has a great impact on like epigenetic expression nowadays.
Uh huh.
How fast society has shifted from like being an agricultural society to, being a massive city, capitalist, cars everywhere, technological
Because I mean,
advancements.
yeah, even for like Hawaiians and stuff like that, 100 years ago, Hawaii was.
Hawaii, 100 years ago,
I think Hawaii was still
Hawaii was
like
still
it's
transitioning the
yeah, it was still its own
colonization
country.
for when they over. Nah, that was actually in the late 1800s when the Americans essentially overthrew the Hawaiian government and they overthrew the queen.
Let's see, 1959 is when Hawaii was granted statehood.
Yeah, but before that, it was like in the late 1800s that they basically overthrew Hawaiians like long-standing hierarchy and kingdom
Yeah,
essentially.
but it's crazy. So that means even 100 years ago, they were a completely different like population. So that I mean, they weren't a tourist destination. I mean, we weren't even flying really 100 years
Yeah,
ago.
no.
So the people there were probably still hunter gatherers and fishers and navigators and stuff like that.
Yeah, for the most part,
Navigating
I
the
would say so.
island and stuff like that. So that's just one example. Another really interesting example is with indigenous populations as well. Intergenerational trauma from colonization, forced assimilation, and displacement is associated with increased rates of depression, substance abuse, and other psychological conditions. So it's crazy. I mean, you
Colonialism.
look at like even indigenous populations like in the on the west coast in California and stuff like that. You look at them and it's like the Spanish came and had their whole I don't even remember what it's called, but like setting up the missions across the coast
Yeah,
and
yeah, that
forcing them
happened.
to
That
be in
happened a
these.
lot in California. Like,
Well, that was the big thing in California is like,
yeah,
and even in
the
schools, we're
Spanish
taught early
missions.
that like, oh, these missions are super cool, but in reality, they don't really tell you what happened to the
Cool.
indigenous population.
Interesting fact about the missions, like in California. Uh, when the Spanish came, there was about 300,000 Native American, like indigenous people living in California.
Oh wow,
After they left, there was barely 100,000. They essentially
killed off
killed
66%.
directly or indirectly 2/3 of the population.
That's really crazy.
The impacts of religious malpractice
Yeah,
in the
just a
world.
reminder to everybody, we are on stolen land. So
We are all living on a Indian burial gravesite.
yeah, I mean, who knows where it
Or
could be. I
we
know, like
made civilization on
what
an
one thing I
Indian burial
one
gravesite.
thing I was told a long time ago is like whenever you see just random like construction on the freeway, like in the middle of the freeway, it's highly likely that that was like
An Indian burial ground.
like there's like some sort of native artifacts, and like the thing is like when they find out that it's there, they have to like go down immediately and find
Well,
it.
well, and we know that there was a highly rich indigenous population in California because
Yes.
every mountain had a name. It wasn't just like that mountain or this hill. This mountain had a name. The mountain behind that had a name. The peak here had a name.
Yeah.
Everything was already named before the Spanish or before westward expansion.
But now you look at everything, you have like the San Bernardino Mountains or
Yeah.
something like that, and it's like obviously that's Spanish.
Yes, exactly. They came and renamed everything.
So another interesting concept or another interesting example is on Asian populations is studies on prenatal stress in Chinese and Indian communities suggest that early life stressors influence later psychological resilience and cognitive development.
Okay.
So, all right,
All right,
okay.
we're back
Quick
after
little-
experiencing our daily dose of technical
Yeah,
difficulties.
just a little intermission. But as we were saying, we talked about Asian population, and you know, prenatal stress can develop or can lead to psychological resilience, and cognitive development. Which, if you look like from a psychological standpoint, there's not a lot of Asian or Indian clients. Now, I don't know if that really ties into the culture of not accepting or not being a big fan of like therapy,
Well,
but also like there's low numbers of them dealing with severe psychological disorders.
well, I feel that also westernized therapy is not necessarily designed for the Eastern cultures
Yeah, that is
because
true.
westernized therapy is highly focused on the individual as the agent of change and as the person that can sort of fix themselves.
Yeah, because individualistic versus
It's very
collectivistic
very
cultures.
individualistic center therapy, whereas on the East you can't really practice the same therapy with people from the East that have a whole different collective culture.
Yeah, their brains literally work differently. It's like
Yeah,
so hard to
yeah.
talk
Again,
to them.
another epigenetic change within
Yeah.
the way you perceive the world based upon your culture and the all of these things.
So now let's get into the nitty gritty, right? So, excuse me. I wrote some really interesting stuff on Latin American populations, right? So, epigenetic studies in Latin American populations show the impact of poverty and migration stress on mental health outcomes in Latino populations, particularly in immigrant families adapting to new environments. So, this is huge here in central Southern California. We have a monstrous population of immigrant families, right? So Los Angeles is the number one city with the most Hispanics in the U.S. So, I mean, it figures, right? We're right next to Mexico. LA is the big spot where everybody goes to, they move to make a better life for themselves. But when you look, there's so much stress involved in assimilating into a new culture, a new country. And for a lot of families, unfortunately, it's not as easy as just getting a visa and coming over. Like, there's a lot of people that have to, by any means necessary, you know, try to get a new, better life, right? But that's highly stressful on yourself as a person. And now there's evidence that shows that it has effects on your children and your children's children.
Well, it's also interesting seeing, like, I know some people. Their parents are immigrants, came from Latin America, whatever country it is, cross the border, they work their ass off
Uh huh.
to earn something in life and to be stable. And then they have kids who play video games all day. Like, you have parents that
Or kids
struggled
that gangbang.
so much
Yeah.
to get here. And then you have kids that grew up here having all of the quote unquote comforts of American culture that don't appreciate it.
Yeah. Like my dad, for example, he's from Peru. I don't know exactly remember when he came to the U.S., but he did not come here legally. He's legal now. He got his green card. Or he was granted citizenship. I think back in like 2006 or seven. Pretty cool. Super proud of him. But he's been through a lot. Like, I remember even hearing early on in my life, he worked at like not a mechanic shop, but I think he worked for like Ford or something. And whenever like the real janitor custodian was out sick, he was a mechanic. My dad, they would just offload my dad to go clean the bathrooms and do shit like that. And it's like, they thought because he didn't speak English as well or stuff like that. They were like, oh, he can just let's just send this guy. So even stuff like that, like my dad's very chill. Like, honestly, he looks like he deals with no stress in his life. He bro's always playing Candy Crush or games on his iPad.
Candy Crush.
But like even stress like that can influence stuff later in life. Like my sister, she's chill, but she freaks out so much. So that's like evidence of how maybe those factors.
Well, and I mean, stress has been a highly studied concept
yeah,
for
yeah.
biologists, psychologists,
Stress is like stress
neuroscientists,
can be
evolutionary
quantified.
biologists. Yes,
The
it's
stress
highly
hormone
it's
is
highly quantifiable and it's highly been studied. So we
cortisol, right?
yes,
Cortisol is stress hormone.
yeah, so we have a really good inference of what stress does to people, and
Absolutely.
it's not good. And you can see massive correlations of whether it's stress, like the stress I'm feeling now in my overall health, my stress, my child's overall health, the overall stress of the family, and how it's huge. It's huge.
One little side factoid is if you are experiencing a lot of stress and you are pushing out a lot of cortisol, your face will puff up. So like this part specifically. So I don't know if you see girls with those gua sha. They do that. I mean, it's not necessarily. I mean, it's not really gonna do anything. It's kind of just displacing the puffiness, but the less stress you have in your life, like the more shaped your face will be.
Well, and like the better you'll age,
The better you will
considering
look too.
facts like nutrition and exercise, living a relatively stress-free life does have better outcomes.
Yeah, like we talked about with the blue zones and stuff like that. Those
Yes.
people don't experience a lot of stress.
Exactly. So
So
a huge thing, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but everyone in
take us on a
society
trip.
needs to find a way to deal with stress, and I feel that
Oh yeah.
that's not taught enough in education. Like stress is something that we're all gonna experience. Period. There's no escaping it. It's it's just like happiness or sadness or any other human feeling. But it's important for us to learn how to deal with stress,
Correct.
and we don't enforce that enough in society.
Mm.
We don't teach people how to deal with it.
How do you deal with stress?
I hike a lot,
Yeah, you like
honestly.
the
I
outdoors.
like the outdoors, and I feel that is one of the
It's a beautiful
easiest.
disconnect.
It's one of the easiest way to disconnect from your immediate environment and understand how simple life can be when you're sitting in a forest next to a river.
Feels very primal.
It is. It is very primal. Now, this is not necessarily something that's highly accessible to everyone because you
Yeah.
also have people living in like Nebraska, Minnesota. No offense to people that live there, but there's really not much to see over there, man.
We're not making fun of you guys. It's just like
Yeah, we're talking about people that don't really live within
if
environments
you live in
where
Nebraska,
where you have
sorry.
the nature to go out to. We're really blessed to live in such a beautiful state,
Yeah.
like California.
It's awesome here. Yeah.
Yes. All right, back to it.
So now to the nitty gritty. Hispanics, in fact, have a genetic advantage when it comes to boxing. Having over 200 boxing champions, second to the U.S., which has more. This is because the APOE E4 gene, which encourages Alzheimer's, is essentially non-existent in the Mexican population. This is effective for boxing as they receive a lot of head trauma, but are able to recover quicker and have longer careers due to no onset of early Alzheimer's. So that's crazy, huh? So you think of some of the best boxers that you could think of,
That's actually really interesting.
like
information.
Canelo Alvarez, right? Canelo?
Yeah.
Yeah. That fool's really, really good. And there's another thing that I'll get into, which we'll see, but he was a monster for a long time. Like he was really talented, and he was predisposed to being really good. Additionally, Mexicans have a very high portion of the XX mutation in the actin N3 gene, where X is endurance and R is explosiveness, and are the most XX population in the world, which makes them really good at endurance sports, i.e., soccer, long distance running, even boxing, which actually has a lot of cardio and conditioning needed for the sport in general. So if you know boxing, unless you're finishing fights in the first round, which nowadays nobody is, you need extreme amounts of conditioning.
You do.
Because it's
both mental and physical and
when you're fighting for your life, which kind of that's what boxing is. You're fighting someone, not to the death, but you're fighting someone like max as hard as you can.
But a lot of boxers,
requires
a lot of
a lot
boxers
of
get in the mentality of
fighting
like,
for your life.
life or
Yeah.
death, which is very primal. Activating that part.
And that's
of your
the thing
brain.
is like there's so much adrenaline in your body that adrenaline, the way it works is it pushes your body for a short amount of time because you can't do that for a long time. So these boxers need a ton of conditioning to be able to continue and fight. So that's where this ties in. They're really good with this endurance, and that's also why they're good at long distance running. Like, that's another endurance sport, obviously. If you've ever watched the movie McFarlane, I mean, those were some really gifted athletes. And McFarlane's like only like an hour and a half away from here. But that was like a 5-6 man run crew of like immigrant children. I think they were all children of immigrants. And soccer.
Well,
I mean, some of the best.
I feel that another sport that takes an insane amount of conditioning is bicycling, like
Okay.
the Tour
Yeah,
de
yeah.
France or the Giro d'Italia.
Okay.
They basically you have athletes, right, that ride their bicycles throughout France within a
It's like over a
short
couple
period,
days.
within a short period of like less than a week, I believe. I'm
Yeah.
not really sure. Don't quote me on that, but have you seen their legs?
Bro.
After dude, they show pictures of their legs like completely red. You can look at every single vein on their legs. And you just it's insane. It's insane.
So the distance. Oh crap.
You have a couple really good Colombian athletes on the Tour de France and like in general, are really good and that have set pretty good records.
The Tour de France is 2,200 miles long. Just
On a
for reference.
bicycle.
On a bike, yeah. That's crazy.
That is crazy. And then you basically go the whole day, you rest over the night, and you start again the next day.
That's ridiculous.
You do not stop pedaling for the amount of time you do it. Insane.
So those are just some examples of like that endurance gene, and yeah. So that's one really really cool example. Another really really interesting example is in African American communities. So historical trauma from slavery and systemic racism has been linked to stress-related epigenetic changes, potentially contributing to higher rates of hypertension and mental health challenges. So that's something that I know me and Santi have talked about in the past. Obviously, African Americans have gone through a terrible hardship with slavery, and we're seeing the effects still now in the children, in the populations, to where mental health is a huge issue, as well as hypertension and other issues like cardiovascular health.
Yeah.
Um, however, on another note, black people develop the shortest torsos and longest limbs to help heat dissipate from their bodies, which leaves a high center of gravity, allowing them to run faster. So high center of gravity helps you run faster, which is crazy. So that means they're already kind of
So, like,
built a way.
sort of being taller and like leaning forward, it gives you
Because
it gives you more momentum and more kinetic energy by just like shifting your
Correct.
tallest body's weight
because like
forward.
proper sprinting form, ideally you want to lead forward.
Yeah, like
But
Naruto.
Not that much. That much is detrimental in real life.
That is.
You want to try to lead forward so that the weight is carrying you forward, but slightly, right? So that helps with that. But on another note, additionally, they have a super high concentration of fast twitch muscle fibers, which in the past have helped fight against malaria, because lower slow muscle twitch fibers equal lower red blood counts. So, that's also why they have other issues with white blood cells, I think.
Well, I wonder if you can make an inference of like going back, hunters and gatherer tribes in Africa.
In Africa,
and
yeah,
hunting.
of course.
Because I've seen quite a few
That's kinda where
documentaries.
malaria
and
has
it's
come
usually
from and
the
stuff.
whole thing of like you have hunting tribes in Africa that's set up on like 5-day journeys in order to hunt.
Yeah, literally.
And they hunt in groups, and essentially what they do is they're walking, running, jogging in the desert or wherever they live, looking for prey.
Uh-huh. And lastly, back to that the actin 3 gene, they have the best genotype, which is RR, which is power, like double power, which is good for explosiveness and power. And if you look at explosiveness and power, those are some things you need in high. Those are highly sought after things in high level competing in sports and stuff like that. So you look at like LeBron James, what he's known for is the fact that he's so explosive. He's like super quick, jumps super high, super instinctual. And that's a great example. Like some of the best athletes in most sports are black. You think of like Serena Williams. She's super, super talented. Shout out to all my ladies. It was International Women's Day yesterday.
Go women in sports.
Go women. Go women. We love women here. But you think of like tons of other sports. You have like even in soccer, like Kylian Mbappe is super. He's a freak athlete. Not only is he quick, but he's super explosive.
Yeah, and he
super
started his career at like 17. Like,
yeah.
Guy was still doing
Very
high school
young. Well,
homework
he
while
was,
playing in the freaking Champions League, dude.
But what was he? He was wasn't he in like
World
Camp
champion?
Barcelona? Did he go to one of those camps like a 11-year-old or something?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. But he was a world champion with France.
With France at 17. Which is really crazy.
Like
really crazy.
yeah,
Future Ballon d'Or winner for sure.
Yeah, you bet.
And every sport you have people like that. You even have like Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, you have a
Mike
constant
Tyson
of
boxing and stuff like that.
African American or African athletes dominating almost any version of a sport.
Yeah, now we know why.
Yeah. I mean, it really makes a lot of sense, Which then it kind of brings me back to like fairness and equity standpoint, that it is really hard as an athlete with your genetic makeup to compete against other athletes that have just that better genetic
That's why
makeup.
the Olympics are so fascinating because you have like like every cycle, everybody knows like which country's gonna take home gold in which events. Like for the most part, we know Australians and Americans are the best at swimming. We know like Canadians are the best at like hockey and stuff like that. We know when it's gonna be like
But I mean,
sprints.
beyond nationality, you think about like the ethnic, or not ethnic, but racial distribution of like gold medals and all these things.
I guess yeah. I
Because
guess you take that into consideration
certain
as well.
countries just have much more better structures towards creating highly competitive athletes.
Yeah, like the U.S.
Like the
has
U.S.
a
has
lot of
yeah, here
winners, but
if you're
that's
good in
because
school and
they
if you're
love that.
yeah if you're good in sports, like you'll go through school easily
Yeah,
if you're good at whatever sport it is that you play. So you're living within a structure that actually highly prioritizes athletes and sports.
but then you look at you look at our nationally ranked IQ in the like high school students. It's terrible.
It is. It is.
Like China may not win a lot of gold medals, but they have like they're like number one in IQ around like or average IQ.
Yeah, Americans do have that stereotype of being not the smartest
We are all burger
in the
eating,
world.
gun loving Americans, unfortunately. So, but on to my last point for the episode, um, some practical implications and future research on all this. So we can look at mental health interventions. We can understanding epigenetic influences can lead to targeted therapeutic strategies such as trauma-informed care and early life interventions. So like it's all about I feel like with mental health it's all about catching things early. I feel like with most things like even from a medical standpoint it's about catching things as early as possible. So understanding everything that's going on in your parents' life and all that, being aware of that and then understanding all of that to be able to catch it early on. Excuse me, I'm going to
There we go.
sneeze. I didn't.
Also, I want to talk about within epigenetics, it is really important to consider nutrition into the impact of epigenetics.
For sure.
We really are what we eat,
Oh,
and
yeah.
whatever genetic predisposition we have, whether it's cancer of almost any kind. I'm not going to say it can be reversed, but you can highly diminish the chances of plenty of diseases by just having proper nutritional knowledge
Yeah.
and applying that into your life. It's
Eating
as
healthy
easy
is big.
as eating healthy and as hard as eating healthy in modern society.
And it can really have huge effects. Like, and that's the thing too is like, you look at a lot of people that have like really bad depression. They don't get the right food in them inside themselves, but that's because it's like an afterthought. Eating correctly is an afterthought. But when you start eating a little bit better, when you start getting some sun, those things do help. They do start. They do help with.
And you think about like eating properly during the most important years of your development, which is your childhood.
Ages 0 to 6.
Like they've done studies with like kids that came out of the Soviet Union and were adopted into American culture,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So they've done studies on
They
those
were
kids,
they were like
and they realized because
10%
they
smaller than
experienced
American kids.
so much like lack of food and resources
Mhm.
during those early developmental stages, then later on you can correlate that with like cognitive development.
Mhm.
You
I
know.
just read about that too. They were like 8% or like 15% smaller than kids that were also Soviet Union kids, but did not experience those things.
So
Like it was kids in orphan homes or something like that, right?
So you can have kids in orphan
It was
homes.
crazy.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, yeah.
So you can have like plenty of genetic predisposition to being taller. You can have, for example, the tall person gene, but it really comes down to how much, like how healthy, and how much food you have available growing up in
Yeah.
order to for your body to actually express and not suppress those genes based on the environment that it lives in.
Yeah. It's super interesting stuff.
It is a really interesting interplay between like our genetics and our environment, and how it correlates with behavior and then
That kind of goes into this
physical expression.
next point too. Like we could probably look into implications on public health policies, addressing social determinants of health and reducing chronic stress in vulnerable populations, which may mitigate negative epigenetic effects. So, looking into how like food can be a factor, but also like whether it's like Soviet Union stress or even stress that's going on
Yeah, it's
in the
changing.
U.S.
It's if you really want to change anything in society, any sort of behavior or outcome, you need to, again, and I mentioned this in the previous podcast, you need to change the pre-existing conditions that lead towards whatever behavior or problem it is.
That's true.
If you want to address or better sort of aid this whole like epigenetic problem that we're experiencing in society, you must change the circumstances that precede it.
Uh huh. Well, but can you? You can't change the circumstances that precede you.
I can't change them, but this is when you talk about like higher, broader changes in society.
Yeah. You have to be able. Well, the first thing is being aware, understanding it, and then the second thing is like, how can you realistically change your approach to it?
Yeah, yeah. We can't, or we could change society, but change is something that takes consciousness, education, and wanting to change it. But if you can't change society, the least you can do is change your behavior.
Yeah. So this point also ties back to what we talked about earlier with CRISPR. So here are some ethical considerations. The role of epigenetics in societal structures, stigmatization, and policymaking should be carefully evaluated. So, I mean, if it push comes to shove and like gene therapy becomes a little bit less stigmatized and more normalized, should it? Like, first off, like, is that even something that should be available to certain populations that can afford it or that have access to it? And even if it isn't available or if it isn't regulated, like, how is that going to be monitored? Because we all know, like, even with like firearms in the U.S., like there are things that are illegal here, but people still get their hands on them. So in this case, like,
If you have enough money,
if you have enough money, anything is
you
possible.
can, yeah, anything is
Unfortunately,
possible. And now we're realizing like if you have enough money and enough contacts, you could make your kids have green, brown, blue eyes,
yeah, yeah,
dark, light hair,
not have
light
cancer,
skin,
even,
dark skin, taller, stronger. There's so many, and that's when it comes like the moral implications of editing people's genes. Like, how far should we in society allow for genetic therapy to take place?
yeah, and that's pushing the boundaries on not what, but whether humans should even be doing that.
To a certain extent, we maybe should, like, if we can remedy certain diseases and certain causes of human suffering, which that's what the whole gene therapy started as.
Yeah,
But now we're seeing like the other implications, the other side of the coin of
they're
genetic
pushing the
therapy,
boundaries on what
like
can and can't be
creating
done.
essentially a superior sort of humans that have been completely edited.
And so some of the directions that we could take that if we used it in the right way are we could continue research into epigenetic mechanisms, which may offer new insights into the prevention and treatment of psychological disorders. So if you could go in and like splice something and you have a history of like your family has a history of like schizophrenia or not bipolar. What was BPD?
Personal,
Borderline borderline
yeah,
personality.
personality
If you
disorder.
could go in and splice that and like remove that to where you know, it's no longer within your genome to
The
have
thing
that
is,
stuff.
again, like
Should you? I mean, I
when
would
you talk
think
about
that's not
but when
bad.
you talk about epigenetics, you're saying that we must change the environment if we want to change the gene expression or like the possible gene expressions. Again, it takes structural change in the way society works in order for us to further better the epigenetic expression within us humans.
And that kind of ties into this, which is eugenics.
And
Like,
that's been one of the biggest misuses of the concept of epigenetics, something that precedes it. Also, a little informative thing here. Well, eugenics is the idea that we can create a superior race, essentially. That if we pick the better traits, we can create better humans.
mhm.
Unfortunately, this idea actually emerged in America during the early 20th century. The whole
Really?
idea of eugenics was highly backed by American scientists that studied like traits in African people and then their white counterparts, and then decided that basically white people were more meant to be a better race.
Uh-huh.
Highly based on like prejudice and Jim Crow laws and segregation. And then guess who likes this idea? Hitler in Germany.
Yeah, Nazi Germany. That was a big thing.
Hitler was highly inspired by America's ideas upon race, and he was highly inspired by the way we Americans, or not, I wouldn't say we Americans, but by the way Americans back then
Them.
treated people of a different race.
Yeah. So it's unfortunate that like those things have been used that way in the past,
It's
and
very,
we know what not to do now.
yes. The whole idea of eugenics, it's pseudoscience. It doesn't work that way, but it's a really good example of how we can use science or misuse science
Yeah.
to justify racial, genetic hate.
Yeah. Bringing so
Well,
it's
yeah,
bringing hate to
a lot of
different
people,
level.
a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't know that about America's history. How the idea of epigenetics was first. I don't want to
Well,
say
it
created,
totally
but
makes sense.
it was first designed in America.
I think it totally makes sense. I mean, the whole Manhattan Project and stuff like that with like Robert Oppenheimer. I mean, that stuff is crazy. Like, yeah, let's race to make the biggest bomb in the world. Like, what?
I know.
And then like, oh yeah, there's a possibility that when we set this bomb off, it could just blow up the world. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
It's interesting to think about the duality of us humans because we have so much potential to do good and like pro-social behavior, and like when you could talk about epigenetics, we have so much potential to like alter people's genetics in order to diminish the amount of suffering and problems in society. But at the same time, on the other side of that coin, there is using epigenetics to create a superior race based on our like Eurocentric beliefs
Yeah.
of like world domination. So again, we are very confused species as to how much potential we have to do
So
good
polarizing.
and how much potential to do bad.
Yeah. So, are we gonna end off on that sour note?
A sweet and sour note.
Sweet and sour, a little sweet and sour today. Well, I guess so. um, but yeah, I guess I'll finish off with our MMM. Um, what have you got for us today?
I haven't really been watching shows, honestly.
Well, no
I've
music.
been pretty busy.
No music that you've been really listening to lately that you liked.
Yesterday we were listening to like jazz funk from the 70s
Okay.
on the
Hell
way
yeah.
back from the lake with
Like
one of my buddies.
Earth, Wind, and Fire or funkier? Because
I'm
they're
not
they're
sure-
not
I'm
well,
not
they're
sure
not
what
really
that
jazz.
is.
Earth, Wind, and Fire is like they're like soul R&B. I think. You know the song September. Like, do you remember?
Yeah.
That's Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Yeah, a little more funky
also
than that.
did
It's
that song.
mostly like instrumental.
Oh, okay,
Not a
okay.
lot of like lyrics within
A little more abstract
it.
then.
Yeah.
Okay.
What about you? What do you have for us?
I mean, I keep coming back to this. I like really fell into them last October, I think, but I just get more and more excited as I think about them. But I love the Marias. Holy cow! Like, they put that new album out called Submarine last year in March, or was it April? It may have been later than that. Um, but that album is amazing, and the Marias are super cool because it's a band, and the lead singer's name is Maria.
Whoa.
So they're like, you know what? Let's call this.
How did you know that?
I found it out, but they were like, you know what? Let's all just be the Marias. So they went with that. But that album Submarine is just amazing. They really fall into the genre of like bedroom pop, and when you listen to it, you'll totally understand why. If I had to choose one song out of this album that I really really like, that's like number one. I think their best most played is No One Noticed. It's probably their most popular one. But I don't know. I really like Sienna, which Sienna has a the whole like Sienna's what it's about is super sad. So the lead singer and the drummer, they were dating for a little while, a couple years back, and then they broke up, and it, like it really messed up the dynamic of the whole
Well,
band.
Yeah, dude.
Um,
That's rough.
So a lot of this album is about like the intricacies of like how the relationship was before and after, and how they still care for each other. But Sienna itself is actually about like a potential child they could have had,
Oh.
and how like the lead singer still thinks about her and still has visions of her.
So that
and
would
stuff
have been
like
the name of the child, Sienna?
Sienna, yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
rough.
And like there's literally parts of the song where it's like I still see her face and then it disappears and stuff like that. It's like so sad.
Yeah, that is kind of That do be kind of sad.
But it hits.
Talk about sour notes.
We have terrible awareness today. We're so tired.
If there's something good to learn about genetics is that, or epigenetics is that not everything is predetermined by your genetics, and that in a really positive note is that as long as you become aware of this, you can truly create an environment in which you can change.
Yeah.
Epigenetics gives us the idea and the positive note that we can actually change.
Yeah.
That we can, as humans, create a better environment to create better outcomes in life.
Correct. And just remember, you have free will, so you can choose to do what you want.
But you can still choose based on new information within your brain and the rewiring of it.
Yeah.
Same thing with like epigenetics, how it rewires your genetic predisposition and your genetic expression.
Yeah, that's totally right. All right. Well, we'll end off on a better note then. Alrighty. Have a good rest of your day, guys. Peace.